API security best practices: authentication, authorization, confidentiality, and documentation. What are all of these? Do you want to do this?
Sure, yeah. I mean, in any kind of application security paradigm, we have to deal with these four in some capacity, right? So it's just as important with API security. Authentication and authorization we talked about, right? The authentication is the mechanism for logging in and gaining the rights to do something. Authorization is whether I'm actually authorized to do that, whether or not I have the capability to do it. Confidentiality, an example of that would be encryption, right? Making sure people can't snoop and hear it and listen in on the conversation, or otherwise just protecting the data. Protect your API from unauthorized access because it's confidential information, even from read access. And then of course, documentation. Documentation, I have to say I added that in because documentation is so important with this. And again, it's kind of the theme of this webinar is understanding what you have and why. And that's really where documentation lies in. Now, a lot of good API services actually provide documentation for the API itself as well. And that's not really what I'm talking about, but it's a good read. You should, if you use APIs and are interested in them, usually they're really well documented because remember, it's a contract. So every single thing you can do with an API is usually documented somewhere on that vendor's site. Anyway, 12 API best practices. First, you got to assess your API risks. And again, it goes back to visibility, right? Authenticate and authorize, implement access control. For example, Amazon has that ability through groups, things like that, security groups. Encrypt requests and responses, make sure you're using encryption. Validate the data if you can. And share only necessary information, so concept of least privilege. Select APIs based on business need, right? There's probably a reason you gravitated toward them in the first place, but make sure you're only picking APIs you need to have access to. Looks like we lost the screen, okay. Record APIs in a registry. Now this is an interesting one. There are a couple emerging services that help with organization of API keys, and they call them API registries. I know Amazon has one. The name escapes me at the moment.
Google also has one.
Google has one. So that's something that can help you inventory these things. Conduct regular security tests, of course. And then, of course, you have secure your API keys, which is combating secret sprawl, which is that term I mentioned earlier. API monitoring and threat detection. You know, bring in a third party to help monitor, whether it be, and that's number 12, third party monitoring, but also your own staff monitoring. Having access to a dashboard that allows you to see, like what I was talking about before, that allows you to see how often these API keys are in use, will point you to anomalies, right?
And start preparing for the inevitable incident response plan. Do you have one? If things go wrong, how wrong can they go before you notice it, and how long is it going to take to fix it? Those are the two important questions. So you have to know your posture, have network protections. You have to do cyber training periodically. And I know that everyone says, oh, but we did it last year. Yeah, and we saw in the first part of this that attacks went up 67% half of year on half of year, 200% overall. So you do have to do the same thing for APIs as you do for every other bit of computer tech. And multi-factor authentication, both what you carry and what you know, so your password and a fob, your password and your phone, or a fingerprint or retinal scan, all important.
Really glad to see that everybody answered yes on that one.
Yes. Take an inventory of all data locations. We almost always just talk about, you know, the devices on your network. But there's the concept of a DMZ, which many people use, a demilitarized zone. It sits just outside your network, but you can administer it from within your network. You have to be just as careful with your DMZ as you do with your network, because all too often we see the same accounts being used both internally and externally. So if I hack the external, well, now I've got the internal too, and that's no good. So you need to be very careful with the stuff that's in the demilitarized zone.